燃え上がれガンダム。
Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I'm Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again in a new year, in the year of our Lord 2022. We're moving forward in years, but we're looking back to the past, back to where it all began, because we are today beginning our wonderful journey through something I've been wanting to talk about on the podcast in depth for a long time. I think we both have, which is Mobile Suit Gundam, The Origin, the OVA series made between 2015 and 2018, adapted from the same named manga by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko. And we're going to be doing these one episode at a time to maybe actually, for once in our fucking lives, live up to the name of this podcast. And maybe it'll be weekly. I hope it'll be weekly. But we are talking about Blue-Eyed Casval, the first episode, today.
Yes, of Mobile Suit Gundam, The Origin, the OVA, which this is one where we have both seen it. I watched this back in my initial Crazed Gundam binge. For longtime listeners will remember this. Sean, you and I recorded it was the first 5 episodes were Mobile Suit Gundam, the 43 episodes. Mm-hmm. And then, but we recorded them all pretty fast and they came out kind of tiered. And then before we recorded the 6th episode where we talked about the movie trilogy, I went on a binge and watched all of the 1 Year War OVAs. So I did War in the Pocket, I did 8th MS Team, I did the initial Thunderbolt stuff. I forget what all I watched. I watched all of that, and I watched the Origin OVA. And then when I finished the Origin OVA, which if people have seen it leads very directly into the beginning of Mobile Suit Gundam, that's when I watched the movie trilogy over again, and then we talked about it on the podcast. So I have seen the Origin. It's one of the first Gundam things I saw. It colored my reading of Zeta Gundam and Char's counterattack and all of that. So it's and it's long been one of my favorite things. And then I have also read the entire manga. The manga as a whole is not the focus of these 6 episodes, but it is, if you don't know, the OVA is adapted from this middle arc in the manga, which in the 12-volume perfect bound version of the manga, which is what we have in the US, is volumes 5, 6, and 7. I have my volume 5 here in case we need to refer to it. And I own and have read the entire Yoshikazu Yasuhiko manga, and it is my favorite manga of all time, and I think it is probably my favorite Gundam thing overall. It is a masterpiece. We'll surely talk about that another day. But just telling you, I am a Gundam The Origin fanboy, and I watched episode 1 last night, and I'm very excited because there's a lot to break down in this fantastic piece of the Gundam universe.
Yeah, and this is going to be interesting because this is maybe the only time on this podcast, other than, I guess, because, well, you haven't done an actual Thunderbolt episode because you've also read the Thunderbolt manga, or at least
yes,
how much of it had been put out when you had started reading it, which I have not read that, and I have not finished reading the Origin manga. So this is an instance of you have the student has become the master, that you know more about this than I do, mostly because I have the first 3 volumes of the Origin physically from Japan, and I have started reading it again, but I had tried to read it 2 times previously, and I petered out both times because I stupidly started to read it after I had just rewatched the TV show, and because it's just the story of the TV show, obviously with modifications, and it's told in manga format, and it's really good, but especially the last time I tried to read it was immediately after us doing the first 5 episodes of Mobile Suit Gundam, and I got 1 to 2 volumes in, and it was I just rewatched this TV show for the 3rd time and just rewatched the movie trilogy. It was it felt like I was doing the manga a disservice by trying to push through it, even having just overdosed on Gundam stuff. And it's been just long enough now that I read through basically the entire first volume just last night, like mostly expecting just to read a little bit of it before I went to bed, and then ended up staying up probably about 40 minutes more than I really intended to, because it grabbed me for the first time. Reading it has really grabbed me. Again, I think mostly just because I wasn't picking it up immediately after having watched the first episode of the TV show only a couple of weeks prior to having read the manga.
Yeah, and the manga is closest to the anime in the early going. There's still changes early on. It does wind up deviating significantly in a lot of ways as it goes along. But at the beginning, yeah, it's obviously it's Amuro getting in the Gundam and getting up and all of that stuff. Although with the stupendous art of Mr. Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, so yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah. So do you want to do some overall impressions of because again, we're talking about episode 1 today, so we're not doing a crazy 5-hour podcast of trying to do all 6 episodes of Mobile Suit Gundam: The Origin.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts? What are your feelings on rewatching this first episode? Just
I mean,
generally speaking,
it's great, and I feel very vindicated because this was my initial suggestion because Origin is, it's not just that I had seen it earlier, but it's one of my formative Gundam things. I've been stewing on it for a long time, and especially when I reread the manga, which I will say the OVA is a very direct adaptation of those middle volumes of the manga. And I just, my thought over and over was this stretch of story and the way it's adapted and the performances we're going to get to talk about and stuff are rich enough that I think it deserves kind of the one episode at a time treatment, which is manageable in this one in a way it's not with other Gundam shows, because this isn't 50 episodes, it's 6. And I do think they are all, and this was essentially 6 short movies. These were released to theaters. These have not quite like Hathaway budget, but they have very big Gundam budgets behind them. They look great. They sound great. And I think they are plenty rich enough for the 6-episode treatment. And watching episode 1 again last night, I wrote a bunch of notes and I thought about it, and like, yeah, that's my main thing, is that this was going to pay off. I think this is a great, opening debut. It's got fucking Mayumi Tanaka as Char Aznable. I mean, what more do you want? It's this first, episode probably isn't my favorite in the whole 6-episode series, but it is damn good, and I am very excited to break it down with you, Sean. There's stuff I have in my notes that I've wanted to talk about on this show for like 3 years now. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's how I felt as well, of like, it just feeling like, okay, finally we can like do a proper deep dive into the Origin. Because honestly, when I watched the Origin, it was, for the first time, was only a little bit before we started recording Weekly Suit Gundam, because it wrapped up in 2018. Because it was originally only going to be 4 episodes, and then it did so well that then they added on the Battle of Loom stuff, and it extended it out to a total of 6 episodes. But like that wrapped up not all that long before, in the grand scheme of things, we started recording Weekly Suit Gundam. So it is something that, like, if it both feels like it has been forever since I watched Gundam: The Origin, and it also feels like it was like a couple of months ago or something, in a weird way, that like in my Gundam life, it is the thing I did immediately before starting Weekly Suit Gundam, which changed how I think about and approach Gundam, obviously, because now it's like this big, crazy, giant podcast project that we've turned it into. And there's like a weird sense of coming full circle or something, like kind of like it's almost like the opposite feeling of Iron-Blooded Orphans, right? Of recording that podcast and going to that show, which was the last full classic style Gundam show. And now this is like, you're both talking about the stuff that I think was my most fun stuff in the early goings of this podcast, which was talking about Char as a character and like his psychology and what goes on with him, which obviously the Origin is like, it is all about that. It is about a deep dive into his character and his origin in the scope of what the OVA adapts. But then also it is this thing of like, I have wanted to rewatch this show for a very, very long time, and I have not done it, obviously, because I knew eventually we would do a podcast on it. And it has been very satisfying to get to watch that first episode again. Because also the first episode, while I agree is not probably my favorite of the episodes, it is the most unique. It is because it is like this big deep dive into so far pre 1 Year War that Zeon doesn't even exist for the entirety of the first episode of the OVA. And it's like such a rare look at a specific point in time in this sort of like history in this fictional universe. And there's something like so kind of rich about that, about the scope of what this episode specifically looks at.
It is so good, and it's, it's unique among stuff we've talked about so far, other than maybe Unicorn, which is the other theatrical OVA thing they've done. But I remember watching Origin the first time, Sean, and I told you, I said, it kind of feels like Gundam HBO, because it's like these big hour-long episodes with a giant cast of characters and a big production budget behind it, and it does have that kind of... I mentioned on the Weekly Stuff podcast this week that I've started going back and watching Deadwood, which is one of the classic HBO shows, and there is kind of an affinity there. Like, it's the big hour-long, big character deep dive kind of epic, and it is such a cool thing to see. And yeah, this first episode, I love just how far back in the history it jumps to, starting with the death of Zeon Zum Deikun and going on from there. It is very good stuff, and there's a ton to break down.
All right, so before we get into that, though, and we do the full deep dive, let's cover some of the history of the origin.
Hell yeah.
And where this comes about. Because to do that, we'd have to go way back, because we have to go all the way back to the 1960s, because we have to really talk about the origin of anime as it exists, because we need to talk about Yoshikazu Yasuhiko.
Yes, we do.
So Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who is obviously the mangaka for Gundam The Origin, is they call chief director. The Origin has basically two directors. I'll talk about that split, but he's basically the overall director of the OVA project. And then he was, of course, the original character designer and an animation director working on the original Mobile Suit Gundam back in 1979. But his history with anime starts basically the same way that it did with Yoshiyuki Tomino. So he worked at Mushi Productions as a storyboard artist, which was Osamu Tezuka, who was kind of like the father of modern manga and anime. He's the creator of Astro Boy. Basically, without him, manga and anime would not exist in the way that it exists.
Yeah, Tezuka and Mushi Pro figured out basically for good and for ill, the economics of doing weekly anime on television in the 60s, which is the model that, to a certain degree, continues to today.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Yasuhiko started at that studio as a storyboard artist, which is also where Tomino got his start in the business as well. Because, you can't really get a start in the business in almost any way before that point, because there's almost no animation that exists in certainly like the modern history of Japan before that point. You'd actually have to go kind of almost like to the war or pre-war to get something that's not
the only thing is the 50s is Toei Doga and their feature division. Mushi Pro is the first of the TV division. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, so that's where they get their start. They work on a couple of projects back then, although it's one of those things where some of those projects, it's hard to get, accurate credits for some of that stuff, particularly if you're someone that's, so far low on the totem pole, like Tomino and Yasuhiko. But they almost certainly worked on multiple projects together at Mushi Pro. One that we do know they worked on is in 1971. They both worked on a show called Wandering Sun. That's Sun, S-U-N, not S-O-N. Wandering Sun, S-O-N, is a very different show in 2010. But in 1971, they work on the show Wandering Sun together. And then shortly after that point is when Mushi Pro starts to dissolve, because it basically goes bankrupt. And in 1972, a bunch of ex-Mushi production people left the studio to start a new studio called Sunrise. Amongst the people who left was, of course, Yoshiyuki Tomino and Yoshikazu Yasuhiko. And at Sunrise, they worked on multiple projects together. Most notably, in 1975, they worked on a show called Riding the Brave, which is a super robot show, which is one of Tomino's first directing jobs. He directed the first half of that series. And in that series, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko served as a character designer and as one of the animation directors. Basically the same roles that he served on Gundam. And so that's kind of where you can see a lot of their working partnership begin at Sunrise. And then in 1979, of course, 1978, they start work on Gundam that airs in 1979. Tomino directs the show, and he brings on Yoshikazu Yasuhiko at the same role that they had worked on in Riding the Brave. He was a character designer, but I think sometimes you just get people say oh, he was the character designer and that's it, and that's not it on Mobile Suit Gundam. Other than Tomino, he's almost certainly the most important creative person behind the scenes working on the original Gundam. He did end up collapsing due to overwork, because he also worked on all basically the space battleship Yamato series. That's another thing that Yasuhiko is very famous for in animation. And so for the last third or so of Mobile Suit Gundam, Yasuhiko was kind of out of commission because he was in the hospital. But he did come back and kind of help put a cap on Gundam, because he also worked on the movie trilogy. But again, he was not just a character designer. He did a huge amount of stuff. Like when you look at the Wikipedia entry for him, they call him basically like a cleaner on that show. That like he just kind of came up in on whatever kind of capacity they needed additional work. He would kind of do cleanup work on animation, on art design, on some script stuff, on direction, right? Because he was the animation director, so that means that he directed some of the episodes as well. And so he did a huge amount of work on that original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is one of the things that then I think you can very much see how close that attachment is and his knowledge and affinity for it when you get to the origin manga. After 1979 and after Mobile Suit Gundam, his relationship to the Gundam franchise is like kind of in fits and spurts. He does do some character design work. He does the character design work for Zeta Gundam. He does it for F91. But for most of the 80s, Yasuhiko's career in animation is very kind of up and down. And I've read a bunch of interviews with him where he kind of describes the period of the 80s as this period where he really wanted to get out of animation but couldn't really figure out how to do it because it kind of a lot of things were not working out for him in that way. So he did work on a bunch of projects. One of the more notable ones that I do really want to watch because it's on Crunchyroll is called Giant Gorg, which is a big mecha series that came out in 1985. One thing that's interesting about that is that Mayumi Tanaka plays the main character in Giant Gorg, and they cast her
interesting.
as Casval. And I know that she worked on another thing. I forget what it is, but she worked on another Yasuhiko project, and so I suspect that she maybe was cast like kind of very deliberately because Yasuhiko would have worked with her before. He worked on a couple of movies based on manga that he made in the 80s and stuff like that, but not much that really kind of picked up and took off. And so he basically kind of quit the animation business, and for the entirety of the 90s, outside of a couple of things like doing character design on F91, which on F91 it was purely just character design. He didn't work on anything else on that series. He became a mangaka, so he drew and wrote mostly historical nonfiction type manga. Like some of his most famous ones are Joan, based on Joan of Arc, and Jesus, based on Jesus Christ. But he found a lot of success in the 90s and a lot of popularity in the manga space as mangaka, writing these kind of fairly unique historical manga. And at the end of the 90s, the CEO at the time at Sunrise, who was Eiji Yamauda, so Eiji Yamauda kind of started the project, but mostly was Takayuki Yoshi, who took over from Yamauda around 2000, started talks with Yoshikazu Yasuhiko to do an adaptation of the original Mobile Suit Gundam in manga form. And then eventually Yasuhiko agreed. The scope of the project was originally going to be a lot smaller than it ended up being, because the overall thing is in its original tankobon release format, not the sort of like the Isoban or the perfect editions that we got over here. It was 23 volumes, which is a big sizable manga released over the course of 10 years. It was going to be a smaller, more close adaptation of the original series, but as it went on, the origin was very, very popular, and it sold extremely well, and Yoshikazu Yasuhiko seems to have really enjoyed it. If you read interviews with him, he talks very, very fondly about his work on the origin, and so he expanded the scope of it out, including very notably these long chapters detailing the history and background of Char and Sayla, which is, of course, then the root of where the origin OVAs come from. Near the end of the run of the manga is when they start getting discussions about a potential anime adaptation, and that kind of spins around in a lot of different ideas about what that would eventually look like, and then they ultimately settle on this kind of movie OVA-esque, like Unicorn Gundam kind of format, to adapt the flashback material instead of trying to do like a remake of the original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is something that they considered at the time. But they moved to this OVA format. Again, as I said earlier, they originally planned on doing just the 4 of them, but then they ended up extending it out to a full 6, basically adapting all that material. And for that, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko served as chief director. And as far as I can tell, what that entails is that he was mostly working from home, and like, on like phone calls and conferences and stuff like that from home, but having materials from the series sent to him, and he would do checks and make comments and work in a kind of like broad overview format. And then the day-to-day directorial duties at the studio were handled by Takashi Imanishi, who is someone that we know as the main director of the MS Igloo series. So he was the director of MS Igloo 1 and 2. So both the kind of like bad but weird museum pieces of 1 and the really kick-ass MS Igloo 2. And I think you could see that influence like very, very clearly. I mean, some of it obviously in the fact that they made the choice to go full 3D CG animation, which is a lot more advanced in 2015 than it was in 2005. So the 3D CG for the mobile suits, was what they did, looks way better here than the 3D CG did for this weird like PS2 era fucking museum thing that they did in 2005 with MSX 1. But so Imanishi was the kind of hands-on director in the studio. Yoshikazu Yasuhiko did the broad overview. And then the staff, the rest of the staff, as is true of a lot of stuff in 2010's Gundam, is just like everybody is some sort of like veteran in the industry. It's a lot like if you look into most of the people that worked on shows like G-Reco, you just like click in and it's people that are like at a relatively minor role in the show still have careers that go back to them like doing significant work on Double Zeta and Victory Gundam and stuff like that, which is a thing that Yasuhiko talked about in interviews that I saw. One of the reasons he really enjoyed working on the OVAs and his kind of return to animation was this feeling of everybody he was working with, or most of the people he was working with, were veterans that knew what the fuck they were doing, which Sunrise for these kind of Gundam projects has the leeway to be able to do in this period. Rather than in the 80s, everyone he was working with was someone brand new, right? Because it was the new generation coming up into animation who kind of fell in love with it through a lot of the stuff that Yasuhiko worked on in the 70s. And I think that's like a cool part of these projects, is seeing how much like episode directors, animation directors, storyboard artists, art directors, all are people who have a lot of connection to the franchise going back multiple decades. So he works on the Origin. We have our 6 episodes, and luckily Yoshikazu Yasuhiko has enjoyed the experience so much that we do, of course, as we talked about on the podcast before, they've announced that they're doing a Kukuru's Doan's Island movie that Yoshikazu Yasuhiko is the director for. I think and as I said at the time, and the more I've read interviews with him, the more convinced I am that the only reason that movie is happening is entirely because Yoshikazu Yasuhiko just wants to direct a fucking movie again because he really enjoyed doing these OVAs. And so they're like, well, sure, we'll have if you want to direct a movie, here you go, let's do it.
And specifically the Kukuru's Doan's Island thing, that is not in the Origin manga. He skips that story. But a separate mangaka did do a spin-off manga of the Origin, sort of in Yasuhiko's style, in the Gundam Ace magazine, and that's what this is based on. So it is part of the overall Origin sort of au revoir.
Yes, and it's something that I spent a lot of time over the past week reading a lot of interviews with him, and I highly recommend people do the same, because there's a lot of good translated interviews out there. Like if you just type his name into Google and put an interview, you'll find a bunch of stuff. And it's really, it's a very interesting career arc of like how down on animation he is when he talks about like his experience in the anime industry in the 80s, and then how much fun it sounds like he had doing the Origin. And it's like, it's just nice to have someone who has this like very long historic career in anime, but who never really got the kind of same level of prominence and general success as, certainly something like Yoshiki Tomino. But has deserved it just as much, but just, a lot of things didn't work out in the 80s. And then it kind of having this more happy ending of him coming back at this later stage in his career and finding a lot of like success and joy in working on this stuff. And he specifically uses the word manzoku, or satisfaction, of him saying that like the stuff he worked on in the 80s didn't sort of satisfy or fulfill him as an artist, and he feels fulfilled by working on the Origin. And it's a very nice feeling, and I think it's something that is transmitted through both the manga and these OVAs, is this sense of like an artist at the height of their craft getting to tell a story that they're very enthusiastic and passionate about telling, that is revisiting something from earlier in their career. And it's something that, you get with a lot of Tomino's stuff, because he's very self-reflective in his later Gundams like Turn A and G-Reco. But this is a similar kind of self-reflective artist, but someone whose touchstone for Gundam is almost entirely just his work on First Gundam, because that is the thing that he really was heavily involved in and cared about a lot.
Yeah. And, can I talk about the manga a little bit and where this all comes? Because the other thing to say is that, by the time he came back to do the manga, despite having, this checkered history in animation, he is one of the most respected people in the entire industry. Yeah. And so like the Isoban, the perfect editions that we have here in the US, each have essays in the back of the books by various people. Like the first one has Hideaki Anno, a later one has the Makoto Shinkai, the director of Your Name, writes about it and does a little interview with Yasuhiko. And so all these respected like people who are generations lower than Yasuhiko come in and just talk about like his impact on them, and then also their love of this manga, because this manga was not just popular, it was also immensely acclaimed and still is to this day. Like when I give my praise for the manga, I'm not on an island on that. That is very much like everyone who's read it agrees it's kind of a revelatory work. And like, you know, you talked about how it maybe started with a shorter sense of scope and expanded out, but you can feel that from the opening chapters, because he takes about 200 pages to do like the first episode of Gundam. Like he really like broadens it and like luxuriates in it, and it is very different. There, you know, a lot of popular anime have manga adaptations. That is a very common thing. There's a million manga magazines in Japan. Promotional manga are very common, and most of them are not.
I would say it's probably hard to find an anime that doesn't have a manga adaptation, like an original anime series, and find one that didn't ever get adapted to manga in any form. Like that almost doesn't exist.
Right. But most of them are not particularly notable. They don't usually get translated outside of Japan. They're little promotional things. Sometimes you will get like the authors of promotional manga, that'll be a stepping stone, and then they'll come out and, you know, do bigger stuff. That's like the Dragon Ball Super manga is an interesting case, where the person who did that had been doing a promotional manga for Super Dragon Ball Heroes, and then Dragon Ball Super started as a promotional manga and is now just a full manga. Sometimes you'll have stuff like that, but there's plenty of promotional manga. This is not a promotional manga. This is like, honestly, the work I would compare this closest to that people might have read is Miyazaki's Nausicaa manga, where it is like this sort of like master artist, but you are seeing just their work right on the page, just from their head, just from their hand. It's not filtered through like the anime machine where you need a lot more people to do it. It is a very passionate work of art that I think makes a lot of smart updates and changes to the original source material. It's just a beautiful thing. And I wanted to read here because I think it's a good like intro to all of this. One of the essays in the back of volume 1 is from Shinichiro Inoue, who was the president of Kadokawa Shoten, the publishing arm that put this manga out. And it's just a little page here about the birth of the origin manga that I really love. So I wanted to read a little bit of this. Yoshikazu Yasuhiko is willing to draw a manga of First Gundam. It was near the end of 2000, I recall, when Sunrise proposed this sensational plan. Mr. Yasuhiko was a grandmaster of original works as a manga artist by then. My sense was that he maintained a distance from the anime industry. My belief that he approached Gundam-related projects with caution. When the unexpected offer came, it was a fantastic surprise, and I remember the churn of excitement like it was yesterday. Behind the scenes of that proposal were Sunrise's plans to expand the North American market for the Gundam franchise. For the linchpin of that operation, they needed a manga by Mr. Yasuhiko, but I personally tabled such concerns as secondary, overwhelmed by how badly I wanted to read it, and roused by my sense of a mission as an editor to obtain the manuscript for our company. When I received the storyboards from Sunrise, they went up through the end of Garma, that is, the scene in which Sovereign Degwin hears of Garma's death and drops his scepter. The moment I finished reading, I had goosebumps. This was no simple rehashing of the anime version, but a retelling in which the subtleties of Mr. Yasuhiko's characterization and storytelling style, honed in his historical manga, fed back into the world of Gundam with a brilliantly struck balance. That was the exact moment I felt certain that this work would open up new possibilities without fail. It was Mr. Yasuhiko's request that each installment of the serialization consist of about 100 pages. To accommodate this, I immediately decided to start up an exclusive Gundam manga magazine. Dissenting opinions from within our firm, could we really issue a periodical based on one property, were summarily suppressed by the success of Gundam Ace. Mr. Yasuhiko's manga single-handedly catalyzed an explosive response from fans who had reacted coolly to fervent 20th anniversary promotions. It segued into the subsequent Gundam revival and the popularity of Seed. Incidentally, the audacity of naming the work fell upon me. I had Origin in the back of my mind as a name for the protagonist of a hero manga I wanted to see created someday, but I didn't think I'd ever get the chance to use it, and The Origin was kindly adopted as the title for the Yasuhiko Gundam. The fact that Mr. Yasuhiko liked it himself was, for me, the greatest joy. I think that's a really good summary of the history you've been giving us, Sean, and also the just like, can you imagine being in the publishing office getting the note like, hey, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko wants to draw a Gundam manga and you get to edit it. That is such a cool idea. And, you know, one of the notes that Inoue makes there that I think is very true is he mentions how it feels like all of Yasuhiko's work on historical manga, because he's made all these very acclaimed historical manga like the Joan of Arc thing and the Jesus Christ thing, kind of fed back into Gundam, and that is one of the ways I would describe the manga for those who haven't read it, is it kind of feels like Gundam filtered through the view of someone who is very historically minded and is used to telling stories with a historical bent. And that particularly comes into play in the origin arc, in the flashback arc that is then adapted for this OVA. There's a real sense of historicity here. There's a lot of, I think, historical analogs to real-world Earth stuff in how he characterizes, like, the Zabi family's rise to power. And all of it just feels like there is a much greater attention to detail, the kind of attention to detail you can kind of only do in a manga, to all of the little details of the story and how they feed together to create a version of the world building that is so tight and historically minded. Because I think another part of the missive of this project is it kind of combines all the different versions of First Gundam we've had. The movies and the show, and a lot of the original novelization by Tomino is taken for the flashback arc and for a lot of other things, and it kind of creates this big sort of final version of the story. It also takes influences from like Char's counterattack and Zeta and Double Zeta and puts some of those things in the original manga. But it is a fan-fucking-tastic manga, and I think it is also important and I'll make notes about this without going too overboard with it as we're going along, but the OVA is great, but it is important to note that, like, the flashback is not just a disconnected thing from the manga. It happens in the middle of the series, but it happens at the place it happens for a very specific reason, and a lot of the things that Yasuhiko does with the characters in the flashbacks is because of things he does with them in the manga that are different than in the show, particularly for Char. There's a lot of, like, Char is basically elevated to co-lead of the manga alongside Amuro. I would say it's sort of I don't know if I would say it's a dual protagonist structure, because Char is actually even more sharply the antagonist of the manga, but it is like the antagonist is an equal co-lead, sort of. And so the flashback has a lot of influence in on that. And so, there's always been people sort of clamoring for, well, what if they remade all of First Gundam in the style of this OVA? And I don't know if I need that, but it would be cool because there is sort of a context to it that's also important in the body of the manga. So that's just my sort of opening note as we talk about the history here.
Yes, I mean a full, if they tried to adapt Gundam the Origin into a full series, that would be an incredibly expensive undertaking, because it's like, it is, again,
it would be huge.
It's not a short manga. It's
No.
23 volumes. Like, it's basically the same size as the entirety of Kimetsu no Yaiba. I mean, it took him 10 years. It wasn't like a slow, like, trickle over the course of 10 years. Like, that's a 10-year project.
Yeah, and I should say, like, the flashback that they adapt for these, again, 6 hours of OVA, that's only 3 of the 12 volumes of the Perfect Edition. It's only a quarter of the series. So yes, it's honestly, it is an extended version of Gundam. Like, if you were to do it in a TV anime, I think you'd need more than 43 episodes. Like, it's big.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's covers our kind of like overall kind of history and where we come from to get to 2015, this first episode coming out. So how do you want to tackle talking about Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin 1, The Blue-Eyed Casval?
Yeah. I mean, should we just start with our boy, the Blue-Eyed Casval? Because this episode and the Origin overall very much positions, I would say, Casval as the protagonist and Sayla as the deuteragonist, as kind of our two main leads of the show. This first episode, slightly less so because they are kids, and so there's a lot of adults who are doing exciting stuff on the sides, but they are sort of our main figures here. And for the first time in Japanese, someone other than Shuichi Ikeda is voicing Char in this one, except for the opening little prologue thing. So do you want to start by talking about those characters and how they come into things?
Yeah, because I think one thing that's interesting is I didn't remember that Casval doesn't say anything for the entire first half of this episode, basically.
Yes.
It's like 25 minutes or so before Mayumi Tanaka, who voices Casval here, has a single line of dialogue, because it's not until Cassilia comes to Jimba Ral's manor and asks to see him. Like, obviously, there are some, like, grunts and, like, kind of fill-in noises that Casval does, but there are no actual lines of dialogue. And it's a really interesting choice in this first episode, because, as you say, this origin, like, sort of taking out this story, this kind of big flashback, and telling it as its own thing that, in this format, is disassociated from the broader context of First Gundam. It is making Char the sort of protagonist character, the character that the story is about, marking his change in how he kind of navigates this era of political upheaval that he is in the midst of, beginning with, at the beginning of this episode, the death of his father, Zeon Zum Deikun. But in this first episode, he's kind of like this presence on the side of events who is just watching and listening as things happen, and he only really directly interacts with it in a couple of scenes, most notably at the end when he takes control of the gun tank and kills like a couple dozen people basically by shooting down multiple other gun tanks as a like 10-year-old kid. But for this episode, there's just such an attention to watching him listening and watching things instead of having him being an active character that is proactively doing things in the story, because he's so young that he is not yet in the position to be able to do it.
Yeah, and this is something that very much comes from the manga, because one of the reasons why the origin manga is as long as it is how much of the manga is Yasuhiko drawing characters' faces and just showing them observing and reacting, and you can very much tell that this is a guy who was a character designer once, and like that was his like stock in trade,
and
like,
animation director. That,
and
like,
animation,
I think both of those things like come across very strongly in how he draws his manga.
Yes, absolutely. And so he has an attention to the detail of characters, and just he can do with minor little pen strokes what I think a lot of mangaka and animation directors would take quite a bit more to express. Like, in the manga, and a lot of this is adapted for the anime, but there's stuff like, Caecilia kills Sasuro in this episode. And it's very clear she kills Sasuro Zabi. Not because it stops and like it turns to black and she like rubs her hands and goes, haha, Sasuro is dead. It's because in the manga, there's a couple of cutaways to her face, and with a tiny little, like, stroke of the pen, Yasuhiko on that face reveals, like, what her intentions are, and that is taken over to the episode. And there's a lot of that here, I think, with Casval as well. We should call him Casval, because one of the things I like the credits do is they specifically credit Mayumi Tanaka as Casval, and they credit Shuichi Ikeda as Char, and I think that's a good split in how to think about them. But yes, so yeah, I think that is the fascinating thing here, Sean, and I think something I love about the origin overall as a prequel is it is so attuned to character psychology, best of all with Char, but it's true with everyone, and it's constantly thinking about their history as it will relate to future turns in the plot. So, so much of this episode is, as you say, Casval watching and reacting, and a lot of times seething, because he is angry about a lot of different things, and a lot of his thoughts are sort of open to interpretation, but he is this kid who has this anger bubbling up inside him, and we are watching that over the course of this episode. But it's not just influences from the manga. I think as an anime production, there are so many things that bring it to life here. There's the animation, obviously. There's the vocal performance, which we're going to talk about. But there's also the music. I think the score to the origin is one of my favorite Gundam scores, particularly for the main theme for Char that is here, that I had to note here because there's a version of it that plays, I think, in episode 5, the Battle of Loom episode, that is called The Red Comet of Loom. It's on the soundtrack. I've listened to it a million times. And I noticed that it is seeded throughout this episode. You first hear it this episode opens with a sort of in medias res opening to the Battle of Loom, and you hear a version of it there. It's this big triumphant Red Comet theme. But you hear it several times in the past. It's first introduced in that flash forward opening, but then it gets its first full expression when Char and Casval and Artesia are in the tank waving goodbye to their mom. And it's this sad, mournful kind of dirge version of the theme. And you also hear it when the cargo bay opens at the very end and the ship is leaving with Casval and Artesia first going out into space and seeing the world. You hear a version of it. And so even in this first episode, what the score is doing is connecting the fire and passion that Char Aznable has in battle to the pain and grief of separation and loss from his mother and home that Casval has as a child. And that is a major theme in this entire story. It's one of the major reasons why the flashback is structured as it is, because there's more about Char's mommy issues, frankly, in the manga that is kind of brought back into First Gundam from Char's counterattack and Zeta Gundam and some of that stuff. And I think there's so many elements of the production that are so smart about that, and the music is one that really strikes me.
Yeah. I think across the board, Takayuki Hattori, who's the composer, does a great job in particular. I'm with you. that it's that main theme, the sort of Char theme, and its variations throughout the series is so good. And yeah, particularly at the end of this episode, I like the connection you see there, of that the episode is bookended by these two different interpretations or like uses of that core theme. Because yes, throughout this episode, so much of it is like, I think, about Casval's mommy issues, right? It's so much about his feeling of like abandonment, that even when he's with her, he's not really with her. Like, there's a lot of great scenes and shots of all three of them together, Casval, Artesia, and their mother. But her mother is like caring about, or like thinking about or talking to Artesia, and Casval is like on the sidelines watching or listening. And the most, I think, like striking image of that is their last night together in the tower, all three of them in the bed, Artesia and the mother like embracing and her comforting Artesia and telling her about like the moon and all that kind of stuff. But then on the other side is Casval with his back turned, and there's a close-up shot of him just sort of like glaring, because he knows and understands actually what's happening, because he's older and he's also, he's Char, right? This is our little sociopath in the making. He's identified exactly everything that's happening, but he doesn't know how to express it, and nobody is talking to or like trying to console him through those experiences. And there's just a lot of that, of you seeing these moments of him not having anybody there for him, really. Like he's even when he's with other characters, he seems so alone in this story, as everything else is like spiraling out of control around him, and he's kind of sort of expected in this weird broad sense as like the heir of Zeon Zum Deikun, and he kind of puts this on himself in the scene with Caecilia to be the one who's in charge and kind of figure this all out.
Yeah. It is such a fascinating character to study in the beginning here, because he is, because this episode also frames itself as like this major moment in history, right? This is the death of Zeon Zum Deikun and the, fallout of it afterwards. This is basically, and I love the way, and I've always loved this about how Yasuhiko characterizes this, is that we'll talk about like, did the Zeons actually kill Zeon, or did the Zabis kill Zeon Zum Deikun, which I think the origin comes down pretty hard on the they didn't side. But what it does is it portrays it like basically the death of Lenin in the Soviet Union, which is like this sort of sudden death of the revolutionary leader who actually believed in the ideals. And then there is this, greasy politician who was very good at greasing the wheels, who is on the side, who comes in and takes over and makes everything infinitely worse. And that is the Zabi family, right? Who are basically the Stalin analogs here. But it is this major moment of upheaval. And so it feels like it has this very real historical grounding. And there is the kid who is in the middle of it, who seems to kind of understand what moment he's in. And that is part of what makes Char, is that he kind of sees the wheels of time in motion,
Yeah, but is so powerless to do anything about it right now.
Until he gets in a fucking gun tank.
Yes, until he does get power, then he starts murdering people.
Which is pretty much what Char always does.
Yes. It's the only time he's happy is when he can be in a big robot and kill people, and it's like, that's where he's like, if only, like, what they need is like have him put on a pair of sunglasses when he fucking grabs they like rip off the sleeves of his shirt, put on some sunglasses, and it's like, there you go. This is the life that you want to lead Casval. This is like what you should become.
Should we talk about who they cast as Casval Rem Deikun? Because, it's a big task. He has always been Shuichi Keita in Japanese. Oh no, we have a little kid. Shuichi Keita, it would be funny to hear him voice little Char, but it wouldn't sound right. So we need to cast someone. If you're gonna recast Char, let's pick a legend among legends. I mean, Sean, I've been thinking about this. Is there a Japanese voice actor with a more storied career than Mayumi fucking Tanaka?
I mean, you'd have to go, like, the only other ones, like, in the same category would be people like Masako Nozawa, who, I mean, she started as, like, a child actress, or, like, Toru Furuya, the voice actor for Amuro, the same thing. Like, I mean, because this is, like, that generation of, like, kind of one of the original generation of actors, but specifically with Mayumi Tanaka, like, the biggest thing is Luffy, right? So she's Luffy in One Piece. She's also Krillin in Dragon Ball, as well as, I mean, a million things. It's one of those actors that's like, it feels almost stupid to try to identify individual roles that Mayumi Tanaka has played, because there's too many.
I mean, my point about her storied career is that, like, Luffy, it's so funny to say this, if Luffy never came along, she would still be one of the biggest voice actors in Japanese history. You know, like she is in a bunch of, like, 70s series. She's starting to get leads by then, and in the early 80s and stuff. But, like, she is the lead in Laputa, Castle in the Sky, the Miyazaki movie, which is, like, people in America like that movie. That is one of the most beloved movies in Japanese history. So that's a very big role. You know, she then is immediately in Dragon Ball in a bunch of roles. She's credited, but she's also Yajirobe and Baba and has a lot of background roles. And there's just so much stuff through all of that. And then at the end of the 90s gets Luffy. And it's like, you know, it is just one of those careers where when I think you trace, like, the early stuff to the late stuff, it's crazy. And, you know, she is there from, her first role is in 78. And then she's in a bunch of stuff through the 80s and 90s. And it's just, it is a pretty crazy career. And she is also just ludicrously talented.
Yeah, and I think it was probably pretty key here that they cast someone who has, like, worked with Shuji Ikeda, right? Because they're from the same generation of actors. And so there's a thing here with Mayumi Tanaka's performance that I think is so key, that she is doing the Char, like, in Shuichi Ikeda cadence and the intonation, like those elements are there, which are so iconic, right? Like, Char is one of those characters that, like, you know, that, like, Japanese people will do impressions of because, like, the way he talks is so distinctive. You know, it's like how anyone can do an impression of, like, Darth Vader or something like that. You know, it's just such an iconic voice that's so particular. And so when you need to get someone else to do it, you need to capture some of those, like, key elements of the character's intonation in cadence, because it's a, you know, it's a defining element of the character. But there's also this distinct danger of that, of it just sounding like someone doing an impression of Char, and, like, overdoing it, right? Leaning too much into the unique, like, cadence and intonation of the character that's, like, a little bit sort of eccentric for Char. And if you leaned into it too hard, I think it would sound very silly. In Mayumi Tanaka, there's just this very, very studied approach to just getting the hints of that stuff. It's definitely there if you're listening to it, and you're listening to it and thinking of it as Char, and you can identify those elements, but it's never something that is like a parody of that kind of performance. And it's such a fine line that I think Mayumi Tanaka finds the exact, like, spot to sit on, of capturing the essence of the character without ever going too far with it and making it seem silly or parodic of this, like, very iconic performance.
I think the key moment for that is the first scene where Char has significant dialogue in this episode, which is Casval's encounter with Kycilia Zabi, when Kycilia comes in basically to put the screws to this kid and, like, see if he's going to break, and he doesn't break. But it's such an interesting version of it because it is a Casval who is sort of in over his head and is sort of feeling out how to encounter someone like this. And it is a stupendous scene. It is a knockout, like, classic moment from this or any other Gundam episode.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the most, you know, Char shit in the world, that this, like, adult woman is, like, threatening his life, and he doesn't fucking care. Like, he's like, what are you to me? Is his whole attitude. And, you know, the fact that he just is completely unthreatened by this woman. It is Char to a T.
Char to a T, and I love how it's exactly what you say about Mayumi Tanaka. You can hear both the child in the voice and the man this child is going to become, right? You know, I would not be surprised if she and Shuichi Ikeda had, like, conversations behind the scenes about how to do this, you know? It's so well done. But, you know, I think the key Char moment in the entire episode, Sean, is there's this scene in the tank when, I mean, one, I do love the entire sort of tank finale of this. It is, we will talk about Hamon, because Hamon is fucking great in this. She's also voiced by your girl, Miyuki Sawashiro, in a very good...
Queen, please. My queen.
Your queen.
Yeah.
Sorry, not your girl. She's not yours. She's not anyone's girl. She's the world's.
Yeah, way too familiar. I couldn't possibly.
Your queen playing Crowley Hamon, who I love that her plan, and it is brilliant, is like, what's the best way to smuggle this kid to the cargo bay? Well, why don't we do the thing they will least expect, which is run a gun tank down Main Street, right? And of course, Casval and Artesia wind up in the top of the thing where they have the controls of the guns and everything. And I think, to me, Sean, there are 3 Rosetta Stone moments for Char Aznable in the history of Gundam. There is, I have never betrayed anyone ever, Haman. There is, she could have been a mother to me, from the end of Char's counterattack. And then there is this, where Sayla says, who is that? And he replies, Tekida, the enemy, my enemy, your enemy, mother's enemy, everyone, I'll take them out. And then he starts firing. And I think the choice in Yasuhiko's story to give Char something of a Gundam boy origin story, this primal moment where he is in a mobile suit against impossible odds and goes wild, but to do it in a very Char Aznable-esque way, and to have him have that line of, like, what is his vision of the world when he has his finger on a trigger? It is that that's everyone's enemy. To me, that is one of the 3 primal, most important Rosetta Stone Char Aznable moments. Mayumi Tanaka delivers it with aplomb. I think the direction of the anime in that scene is phenomenal. It captures Yasuhiko's art style in those moments from the manga so perfectly. It is the send chills down your spine moment of this first episode, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is the thing, as you say, that it's like, because it is his, like, Amuro Gundam boy, like, everything is going to shit, I gotta do this, I gotta take care of this kind of moment, and be getting handed, like, the world's biggest weapon to try to solve this problem. But of course, like, when Amuro is given that scenario, his, like, main concern is protecting people, right? Like, the reason why he's defeating these Zakus is to save people. It's why it's so key, and this is a moment that also the origin manga does, and in the original show, where Amuro destroys that first Zaku, fucks up, hits its core, it explodes, ends up, sending his dad out into space, all that stuff, and, like, potentially could have destroyed, and if another one blows up, could destroy the entire colony. So he has to make the deliberate choice of killing only the cockpit and destroying the cockpit and only just killing the person of the second Zaku to make sure it doesn't explode. But that's because he cares about saving these people and protecting this colony. Like, that's what he is fighting for fundamentally. And that's why he can't just let this fucking thing blow up. Whereas for Casval, if those things had caused a giant nuclear explosion, he wouldn't have given a fuck. Like, he wouldn't have cared. Like, unless they were near the tower where his mother lived. Like, other than that, he doesn't care about the rest of this stuff. And I think there's something of that in his mindset. If he is so easily able to just identify these people as the enemy, even though one thing is, they're not the fucking Zabis who he believes killed his father. They're just random Federation soldiers. Like, this isn't some, like, I'm getting revenge for my dad. They're just the enemies because they're standing in my way. He doesn't express some sort of, like, ideological belief against them or anything like that. It's just, we got to get out of here. They're threatening us, so they are the enemy, and I'll just take them out, whatever means necessary.
That, to me, is why it's a Rosetta Stone moment for the life of Char Aznable, is because this is not a guy... Because here's the thing, Sean, I will argue throughout these episodes that I think the Origins interpretation of Char is that he does not try to get revenge on the Zabis for his dad. I think he tries to get revenge on them for his mom. Because what they do to his mom, we'll see this in the next episode, is much worse. And I think it is, and I also think that because of that, I think it is more about the mom than it is about the dad. It is harder to pin an enemy on that. And I think Char's anger is so much less at any one person. If he really was like, dead to the wall, like the Zabis are the evil ones, there's a lot of ways he could have gone about that more smoothly in First Gundam, right? If that was his prime source of anger. I think there is a much bigger pathology to Char Aznable that is about an anger at the world and the systems and just all of the things that make him hurt and confused inside in ways he doesn't understand, so he starts shooting shit, right? And I think that is why that moment is so key, and it's a thing that Yasuhiko is going to hit on a lot in this big flashback arc that becomes the OVA, is these primal moments that link to stuff that we understand from the existing Gundam canon. And I think that is just one of the most key moments of that is they're all our enemy and I'm going to blow them the fuck up. That is the mindset of someone whose life will, on the other side, end trying to send an asteroid down to destroy the Earth,
Yeah, that in many ways, like, Char needs to feel powerful and needs to feel in control, right? Like, that's part of where his rivalry with Amuro comes from, is that Amuro is the only person who's consistently able to beat him, that he has ever met, basically, in his entire life. because fundamentally, Amuro and Char, broadly speaking, believe in the exact same things.
Yes.
Yeah, and it is this thing of where it is very fascinating to watch this episode and see like just those kinds of little moments and those little details that are so carefully chosen, that fit perfectly into this broader tapestry of this character that spanned, this entire 2 whole TV shows and this movie from like basically 20 years before like the origin came out,
Yeah. So, do you want to talk a little bit about Sayla, who is not as big a presence in this episode, but is a adorable presence?
Yes, yeah. Artesia in this episode is the like need comic relief kind of thing. I mean, she's not like comic in that she's very funny, but it's comic more in just like it's happy and it's light until it's not, obviously, at the end, and then it's super fucking depressing.
Yeah.
But
I was going to say, Sean, I'm thinking of like the moon at the end and like,
yeah,
it's so fucked up.
But for most of the red time of this episode, it's like Artesia being this happy little girl running around with her pet cat named Lucifer, and her like relationship with Ramba and all of that. Like, she's so completely adorable, that it is this like one thing that you get this one like moment of levity throughout all this like awful shit that is happening to these people. Like one of my favorite moments in this episode is her asking Ramba Ral to go back and get Lucifer, and this is just a little kind of funny little bit with a great punchline of her saying, "Oops, I forgot to tell him that Lucifer scratches anyone that he doesn't know," and then the mom just kind of basically face palms in the window as Ramba Ral drives away.
It's so
next
good.
time you see him, his face is covered in cat scratches. Like that element is like I think it's a very important like part of the kind of the tonal variety of this thing, that it is not just darkness and sadness. Like, it's one of the things that you need Artesia / Sayla there as a contrast to Casval and Char, because she goes through the same experiences that he went through, but she lives her life and interprets them in very different ways than he does. And you see, it doesn't go into detail of that stuff yet because she's so young, but you see like the seeds of that kind of like duality being planted here.
And I think, a lot of the stuff they do with Sayla in this stretch in this 6-episode origin is attuned to, in the manga, Sayla's role is expanded, particularly in the back half of Gundam, which I think is an unalloyed good. It helps the story a lot. And I think, you see this even in, though, the original 1979 version of Gundam. Char is the sibling who is driven by anger, and Sayla is the sibling who is driven by sort of empathy. And I think empathy comes from sadness. And she is someone who, her memories of this time are sad, because she was a kid who had her mom and then she didn't have her mom, right? Mm-hmm. And I think Char's memories of this time are pure, raw fury, of like, they took my dad, then they kicked me off the planet, they took my kingdom from me, basically, right? And Sayla doesn't have illusions about that, because she's just a little kid with her adorable cat, Lucifer, who last night I'm watching the episode, and before they tell you the cat's name, I kept trying to remember it, and I kept wanting to call it Gigi, because that's the cat in Kiki's delivery service that looks just like this cat, and Sayla even has her like little witch's hat in this episode, so she kind of looks like Kiki, but it is not Gigi, it is Lucifer, but it is an adorable, funny cartoon cat who I like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, God, is there anything more adorable in anything than Sayla trying to like jump off the back of the gun tank, like, and holding her like hat and having the cat on it like at the same time?
Yes.
It's just like, you need little moments like this, like, oh, this is so cute, like, thank you, like,
Yes.
thank you for giving me like this moment of brief like levity, and like, it's just like, they just need to have in the middle of like really dark dramas somebody looking at a funny cat video. Like, that's just the thing that needs to happen every once in a while, just to like sort of as a palate cleanser for the tone of your piece.
Absolutely. So Sayla is the first one we're going to talk tonight about today of several recasts that the Origin has to do. This one, we now have, the original actor was Yo Inoue, who voiced Sayla on the TV show, and now it is Megumi Han, who does Sayla as both the child, Artesia, and as the adult throughout the Origin. And I think it's a cool performance, because she has to do the little girl voice here, and it's very, very cute and adorable. And then I think the adult Sayla is a very good, reinterpretation of that part.
Yeah, and Meg Mihana is a great actress. She's been in a bunch of stuff. She's probably her most famous role is that she's Gon, the main character in Hunter x Hunter. Obviously, that's a very different performance because that's a little boy. But she's also another performance I really love. Actually, this is probably my favorite thing she's been in terms of like her performance. Is she's the main character Atsuko in Little Witch Academia, which is a really great Studio Trigger anime. If people haven't watched it, it's on Netflix. It's like, what if you made Harry Potter, but it was good, is my general pitch for what Little Witch Academia is. And that's a little bit, Atsuko's a little bit more in a broadly similar kind of space as Sayla. Obviously more like adult Sayla than this. Like kind of like teen Sayla is very Atsuko-esque. But yeah, it's a really good piece of recasting. And it's like, I think it's an impressive performance of being able to do both like little tiny girl Sayla and like full adult Sayla, and we'll get to like appreciate that performance as it evolves throughout all the multiple phases of like basically her and like through her adolescence into her adulthood that we'll see over the course of these episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. So where do you want to go with this next, Sean? Do you want to trace some of the story of this episode? Because I really do. I mean, it's fairly obvious what the breaks for all the episodes are going to be from even just reading the manga. Like, I mean, the manga, this is, in the original tankobon version, is 6 volumes, and that aligns pretty closely to the 6 episodes of the Origin TV show version. Obviously, this one, it's pretty clear the arc is going to be, well, let's start on Munzo and end when they leave Munzo, right? Yeah. But I still think, like, the arcing of this is so good, and this first episode introducing us to this society, 10, 11 years before the 1 Year War, and seeing this sort of society on the brink where the Federation has a very tenuous hold on the colonies, but it is breaking even by the time we meet these characters because of the agitation by people like Zeon. But I do think it's an interesting choice, and I think this is very intentional in the manga, and I think it's very intentional in the anime, that we start with Zeon's death. We don't really see him as an active living presence. I can imagine a version of this story that starts even earlier, where we see, like, what was their relationship with their dad? And I think the implication is they didn't really have one. Do you share that interpretation, Sean?
Yeah, like this is where I think that like historical element of the storytelling is so vital. Is like it as with any like actual like a proper piece of sort of like history understands that there are like things that we just don't know, right? Because so much of history is assumptions that people make about things. And I like that here. I think Yasuhiko has such a deft touch with a lot of this stuff of not trying to tell you very specifically exactly what has happened for some of these things. And instead you have to sort of try to figure out or get a sense of your own interpretation. And I'm with you that for sure Zeon Zum Deikun, the impression you get is that he didn't have like a super like in-depth relationship with his children. I think it is another like key moment though for Casval that he doesn't have any moment with his dad, right? Like at least Artesia has like the one moment of him picking her up and holding her, and then it's one of like many really great touches early, like in the first 5 to 10 minutes with Zeon Zum Deikun, where they intentionally animate certain sequences as if they were a 70s anime. And that's one of those shots where they basically animate it as though it is like this still image that they do. That 1979 Gundam did a lot with, like, when the shot I think of in that show is Kai after his sort of girlfriend has died at the end of that episode, and it's this super highly detailed basically painting that doesn't actually animate. They do that stylistically with him picking up Artesia as well, and so you get that one shot of a sense of he does care about his family, but he also cares about the big scale of like all this like political stuff that he's fighting for. And Casval doesn't get this moment of his dad picking up and hugging him the night before Zeon goes to give his speech. And then the other critical thing is that you are not given an explicit reason for why Zeon Zum Deikun dies. And there are like you're given like 2 clear things you can pull on for 2 different explanations. Either, and this is kind of what I lean towards, and I think this is what you lean towards as well, Jonathan, that basically he has like a heart attack and it's just like a freak accident. He's super overworked, he's stressed the fuck out, like he's so manic the night before he gives the speech, it seems like he hasn't slept for multiple days, and then the moment when he's about to give his speech, he just basically has a heart attack or some sort of other kind of critical health failure brought on by extreme overwork and stress, and he dies there. And it's just this like horrible tragic coincidence that it happens at that moment.
And in the like historical analog to Lenin and Stalin, that is how Lenin died. Like Lenin had a series of strokes brought on by the stress of the Russian Civil War and World War I and like the Russian Revolution and all this stuff that he was overseeing, and then he finally had the stroke that like ended his life, and then Stalin came in, you know? And so I've always thought that's also part of why it's portrayed this way.
Yes, but it does give you space to have the interpretation that the Zabis would have killed him, because there is also a sort of focus on, as he collapses on the podium, he knocks over a pitcher of water that falls to the ground, which, like, in, you know, storytelling, like visual storytelling shorthand, is a way of indicating that someone has been poisoned by the thing that they have knocked over and dropped to the ground. And then there's never any specific clarity on that. Like, did the Zabis poison him? If so, like, which one of the Zabis would it have been? Because I would, if it was anybody, I would assume it would be Giran and not even Deigwan, because Deigwan doesn't seem like the guy who would actually, he doesn't want to shake the nest too much. He wants to just sort of like have a stable scenario that he can softly manipulate to his benefit, whereas Giran is the guy who wants to do the big crazy changes and the huge grabs for power. And I think one of the things that's important is that it doesn't actually matter which one of those it is. And this is true of like lots of historical figures throughout history, is like sometimes it is, you don't know, did this person get murdered? Did they get poisoned? Like, well, because there are oftentimes theories that happen at the time about why people die that are then politicized and used by different factions, just as Zeon's death is politicized and used for different factions in this. And ultimately, in the midst of a death being used politically like that, it doesn't actually matter what the truth was. Like, what matters is what are people going to do about this sort of like opening of the power structure in this society, who's grabbing for power and how are they going to grab it.
Exactly. It feels very much like real history in the sense of there is ambiguity at the root of this thing, but what really matters is what people did with that ambiguity, right? There are so many wars that like we have a lot more information now about how Archduke Ferdinand died than they did in the moment that like started World War I, right? But that mattered less to the people in the moment than, well, this is an excuse to wage a terrible war, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I love here, and that is, you know, it is the, you know, you have Deigwan Zabi, the kind of sleazy but effective politician in the background, who I think I agree with you, Sean. He is not someone who likes to necessarily rock the boat, but he is a great opportunist, you know, and he's got this political family around him. And I also love the attention to detail throughout this episode, and it's going to be true in all 6, of, I think, the very accurate characterization of these Zabis as a den of fucking vipers and kind of idiots who, like, do often stupid and self-destructive things and are fighting with each other as much as they are fighting with the outside world. And even as they are making this power grab throughout this first hour, you also see the seeds of their own destruction, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's another one of those historical things that is very true of lots of aristocratic and particularly monarchical families, is that, you know, the most, you know, if you're like a king or a high-ranking noble, the person who's most likely going to get your fucking head chopped off is like your brother or your son. You know, like it's someone else who is like in some sort of line to take advantage of your death, which is almost always going to be. I mean, and it's true of, like, I guess, modern day. Like, it's always like the spouse, right? It's always like, who is the person that's going to materially benefit from this murder, from this action. And you see that whole attitude amongst the Zabis, with the exception of like Dozel is like the one good guy, right? Like he's not a good guy in that he's still ultimately going to fight for people that are fucking awful pieces of shit, but he is, you know, he's a very gentle, sweet person at heart, and I love that like characterization is very true in the original show, right? Like, he's the guy who has the wife and the daughter, because he's Minerva's father. And I like, you see that kind of characterization here. But then he's all of his like sort of 3 older siblings, Giran, Cassilia, and the one who gets murdered, whose name I can't remember because he exists to get fucking got.
Sasro.
Yeah, Sasro. All 3 of them are the fucking vipers, because they are the ones who really care about being on like that throne, basically.
Here's a little detail I love in this first episode. Every member of the Zabi family except Dozel has a moment where they look in the eyes of the person who's going to kill them, right? Obviously, you have Sasro and Caecilia, because the moment where she decides to kill him, we see, is when he slaps her. You have Caecilia look eye to eye to Char Aznable. You have Garma look eye to eye with Char Aznable at the funeral. You have, Deigun look at Girin. You have Girin look at Caecilia. The only one you can't do that with is Dozel, because Amuro isn't here. But, all of them are looking at the people who are going to get them killed, Mm-hmm. And it's easy to do that because they're all their own family, other than Char. And Char, they're doing everything they can to make sure that kid's going to want to kill them, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's not good. But I love the flip side of this with the Zabi. We'll talk more about the Zabis in a second, but you also have the Ral family. And I like the expansion of the character of Jimba Ral as kind of also crazy. He's like the other Zeon Zum Deikun, who is he's dyed in the wool, he believes this stuff, but he is also overstressed and overworked and has lost the thread on this whole revolution,
Yeah, I mean, it's just this sense of that, he's kind of over the hill, right? He's very old. He's at the end of his sort of he's kind of going senile basically at this point. And he's got his little weird bunker right later in the episode that Ramba finds him in their mansion. That's covered with pictures of him when he was younger and medals and all that. He's got this little survivalist fucking bunker out back basically. Yeah, and then I like that characterization because we never knew anything about Jimba Ral other than that Ramba Ral had a dad and his name was Jimba, and that is very funny. That's as far as it went back in the day. But this characterization makes sense and is a good contrast for Ramba. I think you get the sense that Jimba was probably more like Ramba in his youth when he was young and he was in the military and he was there with Zeon Zum Deikun, pushing for this revolution. But he has basically aged out of that and he doesn't really understand that fact yet.
Yeah. Which means you also have the characterization of Ramba Ral, who gets to be a major character throughout the origin. And I think a lot of what they do with Ramba Ral is really cool and is also connected to, at this point in the manga, you would have already had the death of Ramba Ral because that happens before the flashback. And one of the things Yasuhiko does throughout the manga is, we've made fun of this before, that in the official canon, Ramba Ral is 35 or something, which makes absolutely no sense in the original 1979 anime where he's clearly in his mid-50s or something, right? Uh-huh. And Yasuhiko does rework it so that timeline makes sense. Ramba Ral is younger in the manga, and obviously he's younger still here in the flashback. But I really love Ramba Ral throughout all 6 of these, and his characterization here, and especially his relationship with Crowley Hamon. Fucking one of my favorite things about this episode and the ones to come.
Yeah, and this is one of our recasts, right, is Shigeo Kiyama voices Ramba Ral, and he does a great job. I'm not super familiar with Kiyama's work. I haven't seen a lot of the other stuff that he's been in, but he does a really great job here. And again, one of my favorite moments in the whole episode is him interacting with Artesia, and it's just the most... it's what you wanted to see Ramba Ral get to do, right? And when you saw that Ramba Ral is he's this good... he's this good dad, right? Or this good uncle. And he has that relationship, right? There is that history there between him and Artesia in the original show. You just don't ever get to see that actual flashback. It's just through implication, and there are a couple of interactions before Ramba Ral is killed. And it's so sweet getting to see the two of them together and get to see Ramba Ral be happy for a little bit and get to interact with these people and not have to be the tool of the Zabi family that he hates, which is basically his role for the rest of the series of Gundam, right? This is his one moment of just getting to be kind of out from underneath a lot of that shit for a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, he sows his own destiny in this one, because the only way for him to survive after he makes the moves at the end of this episode is to kind of be a tool, right?
Yeah.
But they do, I think, a good amount of attention here to painting this picture of Ramba Ral's life as it's exactly who we saw in the original series. He's very competent soldier, very respected, very caring, the kind of guy that if you're in the military, you would kill to have as your commander, right? Because that dude is either going to take care of you or give you a really good death. It's kind of what you get from Ramba Ral. And of course, in this one, we also see that, he's part of this important political family, and he's built this basically network of information with his lovely, not quite wife, not quite girlfriend, not quite partner, something, Crowley Hamon, recast here as Miyuki Sawashiro, who does amazing work here and in the episodes to come. Are you happy, Sean, that your queen got to voice one of the great space queens, Crowley Hamon?
Yeah. I mean, it's perfect casting, you know? I mean, it's very much the kind of, like, character that, like, Miyuki Sawashiro, it's, like, very much in her wheelhouse, right? Of this, like, sort of femme fatale-ish
like Fujiko Mine or something, yeah.
Yeah, where she's like she's the one who's like really in control, and she has just like a bunch of really great moments. I think most particularly the scene in the gun tank when she has to like threaten those other men and she just like beats the shit out of them basically, is fucking amazing. And it's one of those where like it's why you want someone like Miyuki Sawashiro, who she can just project so much power and control through her voice, as well as just being like kind of fun and seductive and all that kind of stuff. It's just, you know, it's Miyuki Sawashiro doing what she does extremely well, which is she's the best there is at what she does. So
yeah, well, and I think, man, if you were going to pick characters from First Gundam, from Gundam 79, that I want a cool prequel expansion of, it's Ramba Ral and Crowley Hamon, right? And I think they do such a good job of it here and again in the episodes to come, of having of building out that history, and it's what we sensed from that. But, you know, like for Crowley in particular, we only got to see in First Gundam in like basically in the military with the boys, right? And so she has a certain role, but we sense something much bigger of like she is this unique presence among them. And I think what you get here is that it's a very patriarchal military. She is like the most competent person around them, but she has to navigate this world very differently, and the people who know her worth, but the people who don't underestimate her. And I think this first episode does a bunch of great stuff with that, particularly in, of course, she's the one Ramba is going to go to smuggle these kids out, because she's the only one with the balls to run a gun tank down, you know, Main Street, but also she's the person who's going to like have the right people in place consistently. And I love her relationship with the kids and everything. It's very cool.
Yeah, and it's like the overall dynamic that's really effective, like on that kind of historical level that the episode works on also with Hamon and Ral, is the sense of like these are the kind of people that like, if somehow they were able to be the people in charge, things would go so well, but they're just not the kind of people who think on or operate on that level, right? They're not the big political people. They're not trying to make those big kind of political moves. It's like probably one of the reasons why the Ral family sort of falls into disrepair is that while Ramba Ral is the best kind of person, he's never going to be the guy who tries to run the nation, right? And even though he's super respected and he's super capable and competent, he's never going to be the CEO, right? He's going to be like that manager that his branch is the best branch in the company and everybody loves working there and he makes everybody's life better. But he will never be the kind of person who can actually make it up to the top.
And I think that's, you know, the first time I saw the origin, I will just to preview and not to try to spoil upcoming episodes, but like, you know, Ramba's arc in these 6 episodes is intentionally unsatisfying. Because he's heading to a place where he's the guy who's going to die as a cog in the system, right? And I think that's one of the things that's challenging the first time you watch it, but is so smart and is so right, is that you have to, it's a sad arc. I mean, the origin is in many ways a tragedy, except for Char Aznable, who ends this thing on cloud 9, but he's about to, you know, he's about to hit some turbulent waters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, I think that side of the show is fantastic. I also think there's so many like pangs of emotion, like when he walks into the bar and he says hi to like one of his buddies who we know is one of the people who like dies in the Gundam at Amuro's hands. Yeah, it's so sad. But that's what happens when you do a prequel like this, you know? But it's so good. So should we talk a little bit more about the Zabi family?
Yeah, let's dive into them, because I do want to talk about my boy Giran Zabi. And specifically, I want to talk about Ginga Banjo, because how the fuck is this dude still able to give that performance? Like, he was already like a full adult man when he gave the performance of Giran Zabi in 1979, and somehow he's still able to give that performance today. And he definitely sounds older. I mean, partially it's just like the recording technology is way more advanced. His voice is going to sound different, but he's still able to fully believably play that role, and it's fucking crazy to me that Ginga Banjo is like still active, you know?
It's amazing, and he is the only Zabi who is not recast. Everyone else is a recast. But Ginga Banjo you do have as Girin. He does sound, as you say, notably older, but he still sends chills down your spine. You know, like Girin is just one of the most notable villains, I think, in anime history, and he is so good.
Yeah, and there's just so many little scenes, because he doesn't have, like, you know, a lot to do in this episode, but every scene he's in is so juicy, and in particular the scene between him and Cassilia, where he's sitting there with his back turned to her, and he's playing fucking, like, virtual Go, basically, with, like, and it looks like he's, like, learning how to play the game. He has, like, a instruction manual or something like that open in front of him, and he's, like, playing this game of Go while Cassilia is trying to talk to him about some shit. Not really understanding that Girin is, like, really the person that's kind of in charge, that he's the guy who's assembling all the power around him. He's the person who's, like, making the schemes. He's the person who's going to make all these big plays. And Cassilia, and this, again, like, this kind of foreshadows their ultimate relationship in the original show, and then obviously where in the manga it will go at the end. But right, Cassilia is the person who wants to be on top, but both because she's younger and because she's a woman, she's, like, not going to be allowed to be in that position. And so she's always, like, kind of at Girin's heels there. But Girin has his sort of, like, authority in his position to keep her at bay. And just the tension of that scene, I think, is so palpable. And a lot of it is just Ginga Banjo's control of his voice, which is just such a wonderful voice. It lends such a weight to every scene that Girin is in.
Yeah, I'm looking at all the voice actors on it's behindthevoiceactors.com, and they have, you know, the character portraits, and then they also have, like, headshots from all of the actors. Banjo Ginga is a cool looking guy, I gotta say.
Yes.
he's got a great mustache. Also, you need to look this up, anyone listening. Mayumi Tanaka's headshot on that site is the funniest thing I've ever seen. It's her, like, with short hair doing this, like with her hands under her chin, which is just, she is a delight. Anyway, but I'm getting distracted. No, and I love that scene too, Sean, where he's learning to play Go, and it's like this big, like, crazy, like, online version of Go he's playing, right? But I also love the staging of that scene, because it is the eternal Cassilia Girin staging, which is he has his back to her, and she is trying to talk to him, and he is ignoring her, doing his plans, and that is how he will die, right?
Yes.
It's perfect.
Yeah, it is just, yes, the foreshadowing there is so potent, especially after, like, you feel like it's the big mistake that Girin makes is, like, Cassilia has already killed one brother who has disrespected her, right? Like, she, like, that's the big thing you learn here with her in the origin, is that she's had practice before about killing an older brother. And that Girin is, like, the one person that strongly is implied that he knows what she did. And the fact that he doesn't sort of take that more seriously is the thing that's going to get him got at the end.
Yeah. So what do you think about the decision? And I think this is so, it's obvious that only, you know, someone with the stature of Yoshikazu Yasuhiko would expand the canon like this, of having another extra Zabi sibling we didn't know about who is there to die in this first episode to illustrate for you what a den of vipers they are.
Yeah, I think it's a good choice just because it is a thing where because you want to have that dynamic, but you obviously, if you want to have it in this sort of, like, flashback era, you can't actually do it because all these characters need to be alive for it to happen to them at the end of the actual series. So, like, it wanting to foreshadow that element, and have it be, like, an active trait of this, like, set of characters in the past, you kind of need to introduce another character, and have them get killed off. And I just think the way that they do it, that Yasuhiko does it, is so perfect. Because one, you know, Cassilia is the character who has, like, you know, she's just one of the coolest characters in that original show. She's like one of the best villains in Gundam in, like, kind of a more quiet way, that she's not the main antagonist, but she has such a sense of presence to her, and she's such a compelling character that giving her this sort of that vindictiveness that she has, and that sense of, like, you know, she has this almost Char-like trait, which I think is one of the reasons why they have her and Char, or, like, Castle, talk in this episode, is that she also just so wants to be in power and is constantly kept from that, and that she has this anger about that eventually she'll let loose and start killing Zabis, just like what Char will eventually do. And so that dynamic, I think, is incredibly rich. But then also the way that Sasoro is killed, of this car bombing that is staged to look like a political act committed by the Rals. And so it's one of those, like, multiple pieces of this sort of, like, political wildfire going on, that she isn't just killing Sasro. She's using his death as a political stepping stone to thrust her power, her like family, and thus her into a larger place of prominence in society. And that she doesn't seem to be worried too much about Dozle being there in the crossfire and Dozle just being such a fucking badass that he's able to rip out the door, stand up out of a flaming car, and just scream, "Who did this? Who killed my brother?" Ah! You know, like that whole scene is just incredible.
It's incredible. It achieves all the things that you talked about, Sean. It's also our prequel moment for how did Dozle get his scars, right?
Yes.
So we get that, which will come back very memorably at the end of the episode. Oh my god! But yeah, I love that moment. I even think there's a little bit of an implication that like that she is so surgical about it that bomb is planted in such a way that it gives Dozle the chance to survive. You know, like I think
it's planted like directly under Sasro is how it's shown, because Sasro's
right.
like completely vaporized by it.
Yes, but no, it is the way the manga does that with Dozle coming out of the car in a little more oblique way, where he comes out in like against like a it's one of the color pages, and he comes out like in like a sea of like kind of a fiery background, but it's also sort of one of those abstract color backgrounds. And in here, I love how they do it, where they literally start with the car shaking and like ripping apart. It's such a good little piece of in that case CGI animation, because the car is 3D. Caecilia, though, I agree with you, she's great here. I fucking adore her entrance, and this is taken from, in the manga, it's a full page panel of her on horseback coming down to the highway, but they do it great in the anime too, where Ramba Ral is trying to get away with the kids, and he's trying to like threaten all the protesters on the road, but he can't quite handle the situation, and then Caecilia comes in on a horse because she's a fucking badass, also connecting her to Char Aznable in another way, right? And it's so great. This is a recast also. It's Akeno Watanabe playing Caecilia, but man, it so perfectly captures the Caecilia of the original series. It's really remarkable, I think.
Yeah, because that actress is Akeno Watanabe. She's in like a lot of stuff. She's one of those actresses that either she plays like really powerful adult women or she plays young boys, right? It's like those two splits, because she plays the little kid version of Deku, the main character in My Hero Academia. It's one of those of when you look up her character list and you see that character name, you're like, no, she doesn't, because Deku's voiced by like a 20-year-old man. It's like, oh right, no, there's like long stretches of prominent flashbacks where Deku's a little kid voiced by another character. But then she is one of the characters that she plays another role in My Hero Academia that's very good, which is Lady Midnight. Which is this kind of like adult superheroine that's kind of a parody of Wonder Woman, of like old Wonder Woman, who was literally made by a dude who is like a bondage fetishist, and so like Lady Midnight is a parody of that, and I find that character very funny, and it's a great performance. She's also in like Attack on Titan and a bunch of stuff. She's really good. But yeah, she captures I think Mami Koyama, I want to say, is the original actress who she's basically retired at this point. But she captures a lot of the like strength and energy of that Caecilia performance, which is so iconic in the original show.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. I love the characterization of Dozle. And very much what they do in this episode is true throughout these 6, is that he is part comic relief, and he is also part window into this dynamic that is there in the original show, where he is the human being in a family of sociopaths, you know? Like, I don't know if Dozle is a particularly good person, because he doesn't seem to have a lot of scruples about killing people and all of that, but he is a person with feelings. He is a person with some sense of morality, and like he's the one who'll go, hey, that seems wrong. But he is also fundamentally a very simple person. You know, he is too simple to be evil. He is too simple to scheme, right? And so he is the one who, you know, like is screaming at them, of course you can't kill the people in that tank. That's the children of Zeon Zum Deikun. And then it's Giran who's like, no, you're going to kill the kids in that tank. And he just doesn't really know what to do with that information, right?
Yeah, that scene is fantastic, because Giran seems almost confused by the fact that Dozle like thinks that that's an issue in any way. Like, Giran's so dismissive of the entire situation, and then Dozle is just completely dumbfounded by the entire thing. Which is a really great little moment, because that's also where Dozle's scars open up and his like whole face starts bleeding.
One of my favorite scenes in this, they really milk it in the anime. In the manga, it's this panel, you can kind of see this here, Sean, I'm showing on camera, where they open up and it's just the it's the poo hiragana that is all around him going poo poo poo. It's a very funny little moment, and then he's bleeding all over the place. Yeah, I love the characterization of Dozle as like this he's almost like a gentle giant, but not that gentle. I don't know how to say it other than that.
Yeah, it's like he's amongst the rest of the Zabis, he's the gentle giant, right? He's the
Yes.
one who actually, like, cares about people. It's just he doesn't think on, like, a political or, like, you know, a big scale or systemic level. He only thinks about the things that are directly in front of him. And he kind of buys the things that people tell him, right? So, like,
Yeah.
he believes that Zeon Zum Deikun was, like, important and that people should respect him because that's what Dozel has been told, and that's because that's something that all the other Zabis will say because it's the thing you're supposed to say, but none of the rest of them actually believe it because they're just power-hungry fucking narcissists. So,
Yes.
like, they're just saying whatever they want to in order to sort of, like, get by in society and climb up that ladder.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the only other one we haven't talked about is Degwin, who is not in this episode a ton, but I will always love any Degwin scene because Degwin, he's such a great character design. He is one of the most, like, for Gundam, Degwin and Dozel both have this quality to them where they don't quite look real, you know, they don't quite look like people, but I think that is such a great, Dozel is the one who looks most like Degwin, right? And here he's voiced by Jin Urayama, and I always love any Degwin scene because just the sense of, like, the political calculus radiating off this man in every moment you see him is such a, like, palpable but, like, real thing, you know? He kind of looks like what you think every politician looks like under their surface. He's like what their persona would look like, you know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he does look like a Persona character, like a Persona like monster or something, you know? Like, after everything has been stripped away, this is what's left is Degwin Zabi. But yeah, as you said, he's not super prominent here. But he's just I think the characterization of, like, his relationship with Girin, you don't get much of it here, but just in the scope of Gundam, it's one of the most interesting character relationships of this guy who's, like, Degwin's, like, in many ways just as evil as Girin. It's just he's less of a fucking idiot about it because he cares more about the long-term game. Whereas,
Yes.
like, Girin is so focused on, like, the quick power grabs that ultimately everything is going to go to shit because of what Girin is doing, and Degwin knows that and can't stop it. And I think it's, like, a really cool inter-villain dynamic that the original show has that you just get the kind of taste of here.
Yes, absolutely. Because we're still on the path where Degwin is pretty gung-ho about this big power grab the family is making, right? Whereas when we pick up in Gundam 79... he'd like to win this war, but he'd probably like to stop dropping colonies on people too, right? You know?
Yeah, he doesn't see the profit in any of that kind of stuff, whereas there's, like, clear profit in maneuvering his family to, you know, become ultimately what the Republic of Zeon is,
Yes.
once all that stuff resolves.
Yes. No, but all of that is great. Sean, another historical detail I love in this episode, and it's with a character we haven't talked about much yet, we've talked around her, is Char and Sayla's mom, Artesia. And I think, you know, they do the part of that character that you would sort of expect in this show, which is that you understand why the kids have an impression of her. She is very loving, she's a good mom, she's devoted, all of that. But you also see her role in the politics of this society, and this is something that is not hinted at anywhere in Original Gundam. Mm-hmm. It's not in the novelization. This is one of Yasuhiko's inventions, and it very much feels like, again, the historian in Yasuhiko doing this, which is that it's not clarified whether she is, like, Zeon's new wife or if she is just his consort or something, but Zeon had another wife, and that is that lady, what is her name? Lady Rosa Mia, or not Rosa Mia, is someone else, but it's like Lady Rosemary or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Rosa Lucia. It's Rosa Lucia, sorry. Who owns, like, Zeon's palace, the mansion, and all of that, and clearly still has a lot of control even after Zeon's death. But she could not bear Zeon. She was apparently barren or something and could not bear his children. And so Artesia came into the picture, who is much younger than Zeon Zum Deikun was, much younger than Rosa Lucia, and was apparently a nightclub hostess at one point, became like his consort, and became the mother of his children, but doesn't actually have the power that you would expect the wife of the leader of this society to have. And so she winds up, you know, locked in this tower by Rosa Lucia, who is clearly conspiring also with the Zabis. You'll learn in the next episode. I think that is a fascinating little dynamic that adds a lot to this entire thing.
Yeah, and it's one of the ways in which, like, you know, the power structures are gendered, right? The sort of the way that she is treated and looked down on for being someone who's, like, right, because she's not someone who, like, seems to care much for or be invested in the ideology of Zeon Zum Daikun at all. And that's like one thing that the woman like berates her for, is she just runs down this list of questions like, what is the difference between space noids and earth noids and blah 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 blah, and she can't say anything to that. And part of like, I feel like me watching this is also this like, well, like half of the shit that he said was like complete nonsense bullshit, like he had some sort of vague idea of there's a new typey thing, and then some people in the middle of a war started getting some weird psychic powers, and people just started to call it new typeness. But like none of like, I think Zeon Zum Daikun's, a lot of his like actual broad philosophy stuff, especially when it's like spouted at you by this woman Resolutia like very hatefully, it kind of exposes, I think, how like kind of thin and kind of pathetic a lot of like the philosophical ramblings of Zeon Zum Daikun seem in retrospect. And it's more just like the notion of space noids fighting for independence is good. The rest of this weird ideology is just like philosophical whatever. And I think that scene portrays that in an interesting way, because you didn't actually ever get like a lot of detail on like the exact treatise or something of Zeon Zum Daikun, but you get this broad sense of what his ideological ideas were and his philosophy was, and some of it feels like a lot of horseshit.
Exactly. And I don't want to, obviously the only historical parallel here is not Stalin and Lenin, but I do think you also get this sense of like the Leninist idea of this that Zeon was this person who had like his philosophical clubs when he was younger, right? And clearly Resolutia came from that. Like, she's also an intellectual. Yeah. She talks about that, and that there were these groups and they talked about all these ideas and stuff, and kind of like a Lenin or someone who wrote a lot and thought a lot and did all this philosophizing, but didn't prepare a lot on how to lead. And then that's part of why they fall down, is when they get into leadership, shit, it's really hard, and the world maybe doesn't want our revolution the way we want to do it, and all these things are going to happen, right? And so I think that's an interesting dynamic too, of this sense of history where Zeon is fundamentally from a different generation than Estrella, and then obviously, of course, from his kids. He's much, much older than his kids, and then his wife or consort or whatever Estrella is. And I like that whole sense of implied history, because it just, again, it just makes the world feel so messy in a way that feels very historical and real. It makes the world of Gundam feel like it has a real history behind it, not just some like lore on a wiki somewhere,
Yeah, there's a specific detail that she mentions that she and Zeon Zum Daikun were both second generation colonists. And I think there's like a sense of like some of that paints that some of their philosophy was like almost done out of spite in some way. Because it's clear that like the early goings of living out in space and living in the colonies probably was a lot fucking worse than like the situation as it is now for them living there. And for like their children and all of that. I think that's another one of those interesting historical details that probably like technically is true in the old canon, but it's not something that's ever like specifically touched on in any way.
Right, exactly. It makes, because like Zeon's age is never specified in the original canon, but it makes sense he would be older to have achieved the like level of power he has when he dies. Yeah. But yeah, I love all of that kind of stuff. What else is there to talk about with this episode, Sean? What other things did you want to bring up?
I think one thing to just mention is just like the art style and the aesthetic of the whole thing, because it looks so good. Obviously, some of that is it's an hour-long OVA, so it's got a lot more budget than a TV show would have, like per minute of animation. But also, I think there's a really great capturing of like Yoshikazu Yasuhiko's art in the manga stuff, and then also kind of blending that stylistically with, this is very naturally stylistically, with the original 1979 anime. Like, there's a lot of things I think very intentionally done to reflect stylistically things that original series did. Things like the way that they use cut-ins in that kind of prologue where Char's in the Battle of Loom, and they have like the cut-ins of like his face and stuff like that, is very stylistically feels like old Gundam. I talked about that there's some of the shots, like the shot of Zeon Zum Deikun holding Artesia, is drawn and kind of painted in a way to reflect stylistically those kind of single frame, highly detailed images you would get in old anime. The other one that I think is probably my favorite one of these, because it's a replication of a shot from 1979 Gundam, is Zeon Zum Daikun's body, that also has this very stylized, gradiated background of, you have this like shot reverse shot of the Daikun family, the three of them like walking towards the body, and to reverse shot to the body just sitting there with this color gradiated background on it, super stylized, and then eventually Artesia like screaming into camera. But you do have that one shot and that kind of one flashback sequence in 79 Gundam that shows Zeon Zum Daikun's body on a pedestal holding like roses or whatever, and it has that super stylized background. And one of the reasons why they did stylized backgrounds for some of those kinds of shots is because that would be a background you wouldn't be able to reuse for anything, because it's just this one flashback shot.
Right.
So it would be budget inefficient to create a whole elaborate background rather than a shot on the white base. Let's do a background for it because you can reuse that in a million other shots throughout the rest of this show. And so they would do these stylized gradient color backgrounds, and they replicate some of that kind of stuff here in the origin. And I think that that's just really cool, in having it marry stylistically what that old show did with obviously Yasuhiko's art style, which is already what the art style of 1979 Gundam was, because he was the character designer and one of the animation directors on that show.
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that, and I think those are very cool observations. I generally like the art and the animation in the origin an awful lot. I think if there's any complaint I have, there's definitely a feeling I get with a lot of like, I think of this as like the sort of peak of the initial like HD animation era before you kind of get like your UFO tables and your influences from like G-Reco also come in and kind of, I think, reshape a little bit of how we think about digital animation, and simultaneously making it more mobile, but also a little feeling more handcrafted and hand-drawn. And I do think there's a cleanness to the origin that it does such a good job of capturing Yasuhiko's character designs from the manga and how he draws those characters. But sometimes I wish it had just a little bit more of kind of the sketchiness of that, because that's also there in 79 Gundam. Like, older anime also has a little bit more of like, you can feel the pencils at work and stuff like that. And sometimes I wish there was a little bit more of that. I think the CGI on the mobile suits generally is very successful, and you see a little bit of that in the prologue here, but also when we come up on some of the later episodes, they're going to do some really cool stuff with it. It is kind of funny rewatching this after Hathaway's Flash came out, though, because you can also see where, this is 6 years old, right?
Yes.
Because there's some stuff I think they try to do with the digital camera that they're going to be a lot better at 6 years later, which is fine. They probably needed to do the origin before they could do the stuff they do in Hathaway, but it is kind of funny to go back after we've seen the most recent thing they've done.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree that I think that there has been in the past 5 to 6 years, around the time that the origin started to wrap up, of that kind of push of UFO tables overall influence on the way you blend and merge 3D animation with traditional 2D animation has pushed digital anime in different ways, and Origin does, I would agree, has too clean a look. And it is definitely most apparent if you compare it with Hathaway's Flash, which also is replicating a lot of the style of old Gundam, because it's set in that universe, right? It's using some of that stuff while making it very revolutionary. Now, that's not an entirely fair comparison, because Hathaway's Flash has a significantly higher amount of budget per minute of animation than one episode of The Origin has,
and newer technology behind
yes.
it.
But it is, I think, it does sort of stylistically date the origin a little bit, even though it's not that old. It does feel like it's from a slightly different era of digital animation, mostly because of how much some of that stuff has advanced in a relatively short time.
Yeah. But, again, this is sort of like looking a gift horse in the mouth. It is still a very cool production. I will say this probably several times over the course of this series, Sean. The CGI recreation of Char's custom Zaku 2 is right up there with the custom goof from 08MS team as my favorite mobile suit in all of Gundam. It is. That's the first Gunpla I built, was the origin version of Char's Zaku. It looks fucking good. We see that in the prologue here in this episode, but we're going to see a lot more of it obviously later on.
Yes. I do appreciate that they put in that little prologue here, so you do just get a little bit of actual mobile suit stuff, because it would feel weird to watch an entire hour of a Gundam thing and have literally no mobile suits, because the gun tank technically isn't really a mobile suit.
Yes. Well, and that's basically the only change they make from the manga, is adding the prologue, and then they rearrange a scene. The flashback arc in the origin opens on this wide shot of Munzo, which is recreated for the show, and then it starts with Zeon's death, and then the scene where Zeon is talking the night before is a little flashback later on. They rearrange it so they have this prologue they add, then the night before, then the death of Zeon Zum Deikun. And that's honestly, in this episode at least, the only change from the manga they make. But I think it's very effective to have the big action prologue to tell us where we're going, and it's also a thematic thing to remind us that this is the story of how this little boy Casval becomes this, very flamboyant man, Char Aznable,
Who shoots down like 3 entire cruisers or whatever it is in that short prologue sequence.
Yeah, and it also means we get Shuichi Keita in this episode, so he's in all 6, because otherwise he wouldn't be in this one. And hey, anytime we get more Shuichi Keita in our lives is a good time. The only other thing I think we needed to mention, Sean, from the story here is the promise that Estrella makes with her kids about the moon getting big 100 times. One of the saddest, most perfect pieces of writing in this whole thing.
Yeah, that whole scene is just brutal. It's another one of those scenes of where, Casval is just like on the edge of it, just listening, and knowing that it's like, oh yeah, my mom's gonna fucking die here. He's like, he just knows that in his bones that he's probably never going to see her again. And yeah, like the very fairy tale nature of the promise that the mom is trying to make. Then with the sort of punchline, if you want to call it that, but the reveal at the very end of the episode, which is like the last moment, is the moment that the episode ends on, is Artesia seeing what the moon actually is. And that it is this massive rock fucking in space. I mean, she doesn't understand anything of what the cycle of the moon is, obviously any of that, but, the symbolically, that moment of realizing, oh, I'm going to have to wait for eternity, basically, because look at this thing. Look at the size and the scope of, like, the world and, like, I mean, it's an amazing scene because it is the first time that they have ever, like, actually seemed to, like, fully understood that they were in a big weird spinning cylinder thingy, right? Like they've seen it now from the outside. They understand, oh, all my entire life was contained in this like spinning tube, and there are these big spheres out here in space that like we're going to go to. And it is like, particularly for Artesia, who doesn't know any of that, obviously like Casval is like studied and knows it like intellectually, but like that is such a like bizarre thing to imagine that you have never even really understood the concept of living on a planet, and that it's like there's this big ball out there that you go and land on it, and it's like way over there, and it's got water and stuff on it too. It's like that's like a weird, crazy, mindfucky kind of thing, and having her whole life turned on its head in that moment, as you go into credits, is really powerful.
Very powerful. I also like there's so many good character touches. 2 things I wanted to mention. When Estrella, the mother, is giving that speech about the moon, you have Artesia is kind of like enraptured by it because she's being given this fairy tale hope, and you have Casval looking out the window, tearing up and trying not to, and it's exactly what you're talking about, Sean. He is digesting the fact that while that is giving hope to Artesia, it is killing whatever hope was left in him because he's old enough to know better. But I also like on the other side of that, when they get out of the cargo bay at the end and they're out looking at the moon, Casval is a good big brother in that scene. He is trying to be a good big brother to Artesia, which is something he's going to struggle with in his life. But in that moment, he does rise to the occasion, and I think that's a nice little moment leading into credits with our first theme song of Gundam the Origin, which is called, let me look this one up. It's
I got it. It's Hoshikuzu no Tsunadoke, which is like Stardust Hourglass, which is by an artist named Takayuki Hattori, featuring Yu Yu.
Yes. So Takayuki Hattori is the composer, so Yu Yu is the vocalist. Yeah, it's a good song. A lot of the songs for at least the first couple of Origin episodes are sort of like slow ballads that I can't like really use as theme songs on these episodes because they're too slow for a 30-second clip. But I do think it's really beautiful and haunting when you watch it, especially in its full context in the episode where most of the credits play out over the scene. I think it's really gorgeously done.
Yeah, it's a really... It's a very iconic moment in my memory. It's like one of the things that, when I think about the Origin, particularly like before doing all this rewatching stuff, like that is like a moment that's sort of burned into my memory, is them out in space looking at the Earth and looking at the moon while this song plays. It's just a very Gundam kind of moment. It like echoes things like the ending of Gundam F91 and stuff like that.
It's iconic in the manga, too, because this is a full-page cut spread they use as the back cover for this volume, is the ship on the moon, basically.
Very good.
Or going by the moon. So, yeah. Anything else to say about Episode 1 of Mobile Suit Gundam The Origin, Blue-Eyed Casval, which we've talked about now for almost twice its runtime?
It's really fucking good, you know?
Yeah.
It's a really good bit of Gundam. As I said at the top, it just... One of the most fun things about this episode in particular is, like, this kind of esoteric period in the history of the Universal Century that it deep dives into that is so far before the actual, like, core conflict of that universe begins, and getting to see Char as a little Luffy boy. It's a pretty cool time.
Absolutely. Now I'm imagining Char with stretchy arms, and it's all wrong.
Oh,
but,
God.
yeah, what would Char do with the Gum Gum fruit? Here, write in and tell us. What would Char Aznable do?
Kill everybody. He would just kill everybody.
All right. Anyway, now I'm trying to imagine Shuichi Ikeda going, gear forth. That would be very weird. Anyway, we will be talking much more about Gundam The Origin in the weeks to come. Next week we have episode 2, Artesia's Sorrow. It's a sad episode. It contains a very iconic moment at the end. I'm very excited to talk about it, Sean.
Yes, I am glad that we can finally not be ashamed by the name of the show, and we can actually have a weekly Suit Gundam.